Welcome to Moments with Marianne. I'm so delighted we're spending this time here today. My goodness, it's a day of thanks and happy Thanksgiving to you and your family. I hope you have a healthy and safe Thanksgiving day. Our first guest today is Benjamin-Vogt, and he's here to talk to us about his new book, A New Garden Ethic, Cultivating Defiant Compassion for an Uncertain Future. So Benjamin has a PhD from the University of Nebraska, an MFA from Ohio State University, and a BFA from the University of Evansville. He owns Monarch Gardens, LLC, a prairie garden design firm that works with clients in Nebraska and throughout the Midwest. So Benjamin's work's been featured in Fine Gardening, Garden Design, Nebraska Life, Omaha World Herald, and Lincoln Journal Star, and on several television and radio programs. Benjamin writes an award-winning garden column for House that has nearly 3 million readers. So let's welcome to the show, Benjamin.
Well, thank you so much for having me on.
Oh, it is such a pleasure to have you here, and so excited about your new book. My goodness. I mean, it couldn't come at a better time,
Yeah, a new book can never come at a bad time, I think. So.
Well, especially one that talks about gardens, and this isn't your mama's gardening book either. This is actually a really just inspiring book that kind of goes beyond the garden.
Yeah, I don't even think of it so much as a gardening book, even though that's certainly where the conversation starts. I think of it as a book on nature and the environment and how we live in the natural world. So it's a lot like Aldo Leopold or Rachel Carson.
Mm-hmm. Well, and a lot of times when people think about their space, it's really hard to kind of wrap their brain around kind of like, aside from the pretty flowers that they'll see at some of the big stores that they can get. And just kind of littering their garden with that. I mean, you really talk about, bringing more native plants into our garden space.
Well, wildlife, and especially insects and especially pollinators, evolve with native plants. Those are the plants they know, and those are the plants that they need nectar and pollen from. And certainly when you're talking about caterpillars, the young of butterflies and moths and all that good stuff, caterpillars need native plants because those are the only plants they can recognize when they're eating the leaves. They need the chemicals in those leaves just to grow. So most of our exotic plants cannot fulfill the life cycles of so much wildlife in the urban and suburban world.
Mm-hmm. Now, before we get too into this conversation, I'd love for you to share with us how you even got started on this path.
Oh, man, there's so many ways I could answer that.
Usually there is. I know for me it's a squiggly line that ended up where I'm at now, so I get it,
Yeah, it's a squiggly line that goes back on itself and makes funky little designs. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I guess primarily, let me answer it in two ways. The first way is that when I was 10, my family moved from Oklahoma to Minnesota, and those are two different natural environments, just and totally different way of living. Up in Minnesota, everybody's outside in the middle of winter. In the summer, it doesn't matter when, but people are outside in parks, and there's so many trees and lakes. There was just, for me, when I moved to Minnesota, nature was just so lush and thick and in your face, and I think that was sort of the subconscious level of my development in the gardening and appreciating nature and et cetera. But probably what it actually is my mother making me do chores outside, trimming shrubs and cleaning up things and planting a few things, and then taking me to the garden nursery and choosing plants. Now, most of the time I actually wanted to go to the nursery because it was such a tranquil, peaceful place outside of the home, away from our family and the noise of everyday life in the family. And so that sort of became a ritual for my mom and I, even into my 30s, and even now when I have a visit, we'll still sometimes go to the nursery and just hang out together. So she probably gave me the bug.
And it went from there, right?
it went from there, and then about 10 years ago, my wife and I got married and moved into a new house, and it was a fresh 1/4 acre lot, total blank canvas. And I said to my wife, I want a garden. And neither one of us realized that meant 1,500 square feet and 20 yards of mulch and total craziness. So I just went all in.
Hey, I have a dear friend who, she has a lot that she brought next to her property, and she did kind of the same thing where she brought in organic soil because the soil there was just void of any nutrients, and had the earth tilled and did all sorts of things so that she can go ahead and start having her own garden. But she's very careful also about planting the native plants. And so why is that? I know you touched on that a little bit. So why is that so important that we, kind of plant these native plants within our areas?
Well, I touched on the pollinators and the insects' need to reproduce, and we have 4,000 native bee species, and a fair number of them, it's something like 30% in the Northeast, for example, they rely on specific pollen from specific species or families of plants. So you might have one native bee species that they're just flying around for 2 or 4 weeks or something like that in June or something. Mm-hmm. And when they time their emergence as adults to coincide when the specific flower with the pollen that they need is blooming. So, and they're going to use that pollen to feed their young back wherever they're doing their thing, wherever they're reproducing. But further, if you can get native plants to your area in the right spot, that means matching it to soil and light and all that gardeny stuff, then they're going to be lower maintenance for you in general. And they should also be more adaptable to climate change because the climate is warming, it's getting wetter, it's getting drier, it's getting a little crazy. So hopefully our native plants will be able to survive a little bit better and thrive, hopefully.
Yeah, then if we just kind of fill it with a bunch of pretty things. And heck, my friend's garden looks just astounding. She's had magazines come by, take pictures, and she's just using native plants. So it can be a beautiful garden with that.
Yes, I've heard for so long that if you're just using a native plant garden, well, that's very limiting. And maybe from just a human perspective, it is limiting. But if you're gardening for all the other species, not just one species, then your garden takes on a level of beauty that is a lot more profound. And it can still certainly, yes, be aesthetically pretty, but it can be pretty on a level that is supporting everything around us that we need to thrive too.
Well, and this kind of brings me to my next question is, the title of your book, you talk about a new garden ethic. Where did that come from?
It certainly started with Aldo Leopold. Do you know his book, Sand County Almanac?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so he talks about a landscape ethic and how we need to rethink ourselves as part of a living community, and that community includes land and plants and animals and water and air and all that thing. We're not at the top of a chain. We're not in the center either. We're actually probably towards the bottom, but we are part of everything. So this ethic comes from, in the landscape design world and even in home gardens, we tend to choose plants just because they're pretty to us. We'll go to the store and, I like the shape of that plant. I like the color of the leaves, or I just like how that bloom looks, and I want that plant. We treat it like a consumer good, I guess, like shoes or new shirts or something. And we don't stop to consider what is going to be the ecological function and purpose of that plant in our landscape. Because we want butterflies, we want bees, we want birds. So choosing something that isn't going to help them isn't going to justify our aesthetic choices in the garden about what pretty really is. So that's the new garden ethic, gardening not just for humans, but for everything at the same time.
Yeah, it's really keeping in thought everything else that shares the planet with us that's going to be in the garden besides us.
Oh, yeah. I mean, and there is nothing more exciting for me and probably for you and a lot of people listening than going out to the garden and making surprising discoveries of life that's out there. I found a new butterfly out there. I can't remember the name of it now, but it usually doesn't come up this far north, but it came up this north, and boy, that was pretty cool just to see that butterfly up here. And it wouldn't be here if I didn't have all this diversity in my backyard. So.
Yeah, because they were definitely looking for that, to feed on and to, spend time on as well, and again, get into the pollinators. It's really just interesting once you get into having an urban wildlife garden, what develops from there and the surprises that come.
Yeah, and I know to, in the urban and suburban world, we're using native plants, but the native landscape is no longer there, of course. We've totally eradicated it. So it's not going to come back, but a lot of the wildlife that evolved with those plants and knows those plants, they're still here. They're still traveling through our backyards and through church landscapes and school landscapes and business landscapes, so we can help them. We can give them wildlife refuges, I guess, so to speak.
Well, and I know in your book you kind of talk about also how some environmental issues are not political, but it's social justice.
Well, yeah. School. Let's take school landscapes for one example. Mm-hmm. We can look at some others, but kids looking out of a classroom, and if they just see a lawn and a parking lot, that's not really great. But if they can see a bunch of flowers and trees and shrubs and butterflies zooming in and out and stuff like that, then their test scores can increase anywhere from 7 to 26%. Studies have found them to be more creative and able to work better in groups and just to be more focused on the interactions they're having in the classroom. That's one aspect of social justice. Another is, urban areas with green spaces actually see reductions in crime. And usually green space is, we need green space in our urban areas because urban areas tend to be places where, unfortunately, culturally, socially disenfranchised tend to live, where minorities tend to live, but don't have access to these spaces that can, a tree, just take a tree, 30-foot crown tree, will cool the air by 2 to 9 degrees, and when we can cool environments, we can actually reduce instances of violence. So there's a lot of stuff at play.
Well, and it's interesting when you get into that, and also the mental health issues that surround climate change.
The whole Arab Spring, a lot of studies have been done saying that maybe that was fueled especially by rise in temperatures. It was a very hot summer, unusually hot summer. So. Mm-hmm.
Well, I know that you've been very active. You've written many books in regards to these type of topics. What was one of the main inspirations behind this new book?
Oh, my gosh, that's a hard question. It really is. I know.
I'm sure it's like a moving target, right?
Oh.
Yeah, because it's so. I mean, it's so amazingly detailed and just a fabulous read. I'm sure our listeners are going to go. They're going to want to go pick up their own copy of A New Garden Ethic because it's just so much more than looking at gardening books. It really gives a lot of explanation in regards to why we do some of the things we do.
Yeah, it's really really complex, I think. Just taking ideas from psychology and history and landscape design, and so all these things sort of coming together. I guess over the years, maybe it came from just frustration. I wonder if I can say that.
Yeah, you can.
I wrote a book because I was frustrated.
Well, and I'm sure there's a lot of people that feel the same way. I mean, when we look at like the bee population, and there's nicely enough, there's an onset of people are really looking at having their own personal beehives where they can. So I mean, you look at different things and how frustration builds and breeds these results that, to problems that we're having.
Well, yeah, we all want to do something. We all want to do the right thing. The tricky thing of that is what is the right thing, and so I guess I tried to address that a little bit. But I guess I started looking at. I mean, first it started basically with just native plant fights with people, and that's a terrible way to put it. I should say heated discussions. Passionate discussions about why we should have native plants. Should we even have native plants, and what's wrong with having exotic plants mixed in with native plants? Mm-hmm. So, I read Doug Ptolemy. I did all that research about the benefit of native plants, and then I said, there's more to it than this. There is some psychological issues going on here to why we're having a hard time addressing our role in the environment, both our negative impacts and our potential positive impacts. And there's just So I started to look into how when people get really angry about talking about environmental and issues with nature, it's about avoiding grief and preserving our perspective in the world and creating a stable perspective that we rely on as sort of an anchor to help us navigate all the junk we have to go through.
Yeah. Yeah, it really brings us to a point where, I mean, we're in a position where we can make such great changes, and books like yours really help elevate the conversation around that, because otherwise I think people do just feel frustrated and like, well, what can I do, you know? And your book offers solutions for that.
It offers solutions in the way to complicated solutions, or maybe not even solutions. I ask people to think more critically about their role in the environment and really take an honest look at what they're doing, and if what they're doing in their landscapes, and not just home landscapes, but in your town, you ask people what you're doing. Does that align with your ethical viewpoint of yourself, with your ethical perspective of caring for your family and caring for the world around you? So it really, I had somebody recently tell me that a book was more like throwing a hand grenade in a room and then seeing what happens. So.
Well, I guess it depends on the room, right?
Yeah. I mean, it does. It asks a lot of questions that make us feel uncomfortable, and I think that's a good thing.
I think it's a good thing too, because I think comfort kind of, when we get too comfortable in certain ways, it's not just meaning that we're not growing and evolving. We're just kind of staying stagnant. I mean, a pig can be comfortable in mud. It doesn't mean that we should be there, So.
Oh, that was good. Yeah.
Well, and so in your book, you talk about creating compassionate activism. And so is that kind of part of what you mean, is kind of really knowing what's happening with the environment and getting involved?
Yeah. And there's two angles to take here. I mean, there's empathy and compassion. And I'm talking certainly about our perspective of other species. We can have empathy towards other species. Oh, look at the animal who's stuck in a trap. Boy, that just sucks. I'm going to help him get out, or something like that. But then there's compassion, where you think, God, I wonder what it's like to actually be that animal, to live that life, and to maybe not have the habitat it needs to have. So compassion is really putting yourself in the shoes of another creature. And it's hard enough for us to do that with each other. It's hard enough to walk in somebody else's shoes, let alone somebody else's paws or wings. So that's where the Defiant compassion comes from, because in our culture, I think we practice a lot not being compassionate, not putting ourselves in the perspective of someone else or something else. So,
yeah, it seems
so it is an act of defiance.
Yeah, hey, and I'm all for that. We need to have a little bit more compassionate defiance in the world. And I think we kind of grew up around the same era, because when I was growing up, my folks were like, get outside, go out and play, go do things. Uh-huh. And so, the generations now are pretty much predominantly either inside or attached to a device or another. So it's really hard for them to understand how to be connected with nature, much less alone, like, what's happening besides what's going on outside of their electronic realm,
There is such incredible value in sitting outside, being bored out of your mind, playing with a stick in the dirt. I mean, I still feel, I'm 41 and I still feel that way now, So.
Yeah, I get it. I mean, I'm in Colorado, and I mean, I thought California was the Wild West. It's Colorado for sure. I mean, I've never seen more wildlife in my entire life, than out here.
Really? Wow.
Yeah. So, but it's great to see how, it could either be hiking or, just within the city area that I live in, there's animals that share the space. They have some areas that they share the space. And so, just having that understanding and compassion for them, I think, is a big thing.
Yeah, I would just to see them, just to get to know how they act and the calls that they have. I don't think anybody knows what birds they're hearing around them, or very few people do anymore, it seems like. What's a blue jay? What's a robin? What's a cardinal? These are very common birds, but I don't think people can identify that song.
Yeah, or even really know what they're looking at. And out here it's more like bobcats and coyotes. So.
Oh, I like that even better. Yeah, I like that. We have the occasional mountain lion sighting out here, so people tend to freak out a little bit about that. But good to have them. Good to have them.
Yeah, it does put in perspective where we are in the food chain on that one, So, I know that you wrote your book for a specific reader, but personally, I think that anyone can pick up your book and be involved. What do you want the readers to take from your book?
Hey, this might be perfect. Could I read a paragraph from the book?
I would love for you to do that. That'd be awesome.
Okay, I'm going to read one paragraph. This is the last paragraph from the first chapter, and the first chapter is where I just really lay it all out on the line for you. So this is my definition of a new garden ethic. Are we ready?
We're ready.
All right. So your garden is a protest. It is a place of defiant compassion. It is a space to help sustain wildlife and ecosystem function while providing an aesthetic response that moves you. For you, beauty isn't just petal deep, but goes down into the soil, farther down into the aquifer, and back up into the air and for miles around on the backs and legs of insects. You don't have to see soil microbes in action, birds eating seeds, butterflies laying eggs, ants farming aphids. Just knowing it's possible in your garden thrills you. It's like faith, and it frees you to live life more authentically. Your garden is a protest for all the ways in which we deny our life by denying other lives. Plant some natives. Be defiantly compassionate.
That is perfect. And it really does put it all out there.
That is my call, and that's what the rest of the book will focuses on, exploring how to be defiantly compassionate, and all the science and all the research and all my personal stories too on being defiantly compassionate in our world.
Well, I think that anyone who knows anybody that is attuned with nature or wants to become more involved in nature, your book is the perfect gift for this holiday season, The New Garden Ethic. And I highly suggest that they pick up copies and start giving them out to your friends, Not your friends, but their friends,
Any friends, 20, 30, 50 copies. See if you can get a bulk discount. Go for it.
Well, and for people that want to take like a little bit of a deeper dive into what it is that you do, you offer online classes, right?
Yeah, well, I speak around the country. I'm right now I'm on a once per month for 7 or 8 months speaking tour around the country. So I offer some of these seminars and some of these other seminars on my website, which is it's at the name of my business. My business is Monarch Gardens LLC, and the website is monarchgard.com. So yeah, there are online classes there, garden plans. I have 180 articles on sustainable design with native plants, and those are all free, so anybody can access those at any time. And I think I got some decent pictures on there too, so that's a bonus.
Oh, yeah. Well, and I'm looking at your schedule. My goodness. I mean, you're going to be in L.A. next year, in Florida, Washington. You're all over the map.
I'm all over the map. Yeah, I've got some long flights ahead of me. It's really too bad we don't have high-speed rail, but hey.
I think that's in the works. But, what's nice is that there's opportunity for different organizations and groups to go ahead and still book you, because it looks like you do have some times probably towards the later part of the year that could be booked if the right group comes along. So, so Benjamin, where can our listeners also purchase your book? I know they can get it from your website. Is that correct?
Yeah, you can get a signed copy via my website, and then of course the usual places like Amazon. You can get it direct from my press, which is New Society Publishers. And a lot of people are telling me they're in their local bookstores, even small ones. So that's fantastic to hear. Oh,
yeah. And if you have a local bookstore and you'd like to see them carry this book, talk to them and ask for them to do an order, because I know that's I've done that for great books that I want to see here locally, and that happens. So, if you have a local bookstore, reach out to them and ask them to go ahead and start carrying a new garden ethic. Benjamin, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us here today.
Oh, it's been so much fun. I've had a good time.
It's been such a pleasure. Anytime you have a new book, we want to hear about it and have you back on the show and talk about all the great things that not only that you're researching, but that you are discovering along your journey.
Of course, absolutely. There are already more books in the works.
I don't doubt that. We are going to pause here for a quick break, and we'll be right back after these messages.
Internationally recognized and award-winning author Judy Goodman works and teaches outside the box of limited thinking. Working with people from every walk of life, her goal is to empower you to be the best you can be, no matter what the challenge is. Born with the gift of seeing beyond our normal vision, she has an extraordinary gift of working with every challenge. Teaching beyond conventional wisdom, her work is described as life-changing. Visit judygoodman.com. That's judygoodman.com.
Have you ever had the sense that your thoughts might actually be doing something? Ancient secrets of manifesting have been masterfully revealed in the award-winning book Manifesting 1-2-3 by Ken Elliott. For the first time, the author's experiences and stories in this book describe exactly how your thoughts can create anything. You've been doing this all your life, but it's never been fully explained for you until now. Visit manifesting123.com for more information today. Manifesting123.com.
This is Jennifer McGill. My highly anticipated new album, Unbreakable, is now available at jennifermcgill.com. Everything from power ballads to high-energy jam-out-in-your-car songs. I used my highest joys and deepest pains to create empowering songs of love, strength, healing, and restoration so that you can be unbreakable too. Get your copy of Unbreakable today from jennifermcgill.com. 'Cause who doesn't want to be unbreakable?
The highly acclaimed and newly released book, The Hand Part 2 by Lynn Van Praagh Grattan, describes the journey between a psychic medium and a family who lost a son. Messages from Beyond Eternity's Gate is of love and healing. For more information, visit www.lynnvanpraagh-grattan.com. That's www.lynnvanpraagh-grattan.com.
Do you know that you can become a genius at any age? Do you know that you can change your life and create a brilliant life for yourself? Hi, I am Olympia LaPointe, an award-winning rocket scientist who you more than likely have seen on TED Talks, Impact Theory, and PBS. Check out my latest book, Answers Unleashed, The Science of Unleashing Your Brain's Power. Simply go to AnswersUnleashed.com books and check it out for yourself. You'll find the tools to help you create the life you've always wanted.
Welcome back to Moments with Marianne. I am so delighted to be introducing our next guest, Paul-Kivel, and he's here today to talk to us about his book, Uprooting Racism. So many of us have experienced racism, either if it's to us personally, family members, friends, or others that are around us. So Paul is a social justice educator, activist, and writer who has been an innovative leader in violence prevention for more than 35 years. He's an accomplished trainer and speaker on men's issues, racism, diversity, challenges of youth, teens, dating and family violence, and raising boys to manhood. Paul's work gives people the understanding in how to become involved in social justice work and the tools to be more effective as far as allies in community struggles to end oppression and injustice, as well as transforming organizations and institutions. So let's welcome to the show, Paul.
Thank you. It's good to be with you.
It's such an honor to have you here. My goodness, you've been kind of this social justice educator and activist and writer for such a long time.
Well, we each have our work to do, and I found a role for myself to play to support other people stepping up and getting involved with social justice work.
So what inspired you to start on that path?
I came of age as a late teenager in the days of the war against Vietnam and the end of the civil rights movement. And so when I was in college, I started to get involved with supporting efforts to end the war and to support the African American students at the college campus I was on. And I didn't know very much at that point. I knew that something was wrong, that there were folks protesting for good reasons, and I found that there were really kind of two questions I had to ask myself. One was, what did I stand for? Did I stand for racial justice and gender justice and all those good things? But the other was, who did I stand with? And at that time, African Americans came to some of us who were white, and they were angry and outraged at the levels of racism they were experiencing. And like many people, many white people, I would throw up my hands and say, well, I'm not racist, and I treat everybody equally, and I don't see color, and all those things that we say when we feel on the spot. Mm-hmm. And they said, well, that's fine, but there's racism in the school system and in the healthcare system and in the job and housing markets. Do you stand with us in the struggle for racial justice? And that was a harder question to answer, because they were asking, well, not just what do you say or believe, but how are you showing up? How are you supporting the struggles that we're in? And so that kind of started me on the road to taking seriously the need to really dedicate my skills and experience and time to making a difference.
Well, and this has just been a lifelong passion of yours, too, because I know today we're talking about Uprooting Racism, which the book, this is the 4th edition of this book, and so there's been quite a bit that's been added to that. But you've also had other books along the way that talk about the same types of topics.
Correct. And you know, one of the things that happened is I got involved with anti-war and racial justice work. But 10 years later, the women's liberation movement came along, and women were angry and outraged at the levels of male violence they were experiencing, and came to us, some of us who were men, and said, look what's going on. And again, my immediate response, being, I guess, a slow learner, was to say, well, I don't hit my partner. I do my share of the housework and the child care. I treat women with respect. And they said, well, fine, but there's 3 or 4 million men a year who batter their partners in this country. Do you stand with us in the struggle against male violence? And so once again, I had to step back and say, well, how am I showing up? What am I doing here? And at that point in the late 1970s, a group of us who were men started the Oakland Men's Project explicitly to address issues of male violence with men. So it's been a long course of listening and learning and working with others and really trying to find effective ways to support people showing up in these struggles.
Well, and I also applaud you because you're giving a reference point for people who want to do something but just not quite sure what to do.
Right. I think that's true of, especially right now, for a lot of white people who there's such visible racism with the police murders we've seen and the Muslim ban and the attack on DACA youth and Standing Rock. I mean, and then, of course, our administration, the racist rhetoric and policies and neo-Nazis in the streets. A lot of white people are saying, well, okay, I get it, but what can I do? And that's really a good place to start. That's why I really felt it important to revise and update and provide a lot more tools in this new 4th edition of my book, Uprooting Racism.
Has there been some things that have just stayed the same over from the first time that this came into your awareness to today, and some things that have either gotten better or worse?
I think that the foundations of racism in this country haven't changed very much. that still there's deep, pervasive, and systemic racism throughout our society. Certainly, we tried to make some gains in the civil rights movement, and there was some progress made there, but there was an immediate backlash to that, and we've been experiencing that backlash ever since. When I wrote the first edition in the mid-'90s, we were at a time where people were saying we've become a post-racial society. Racism, the civil rights movement took care of all that, and there was tremendous denial in the white community about the ongoing impact and everyday aspects of racism. When I wrote the third edition, Obama was president, and even more so, people were saying, well, what more do you want? There's a black president. We must have overcome racism, and it must be truly post-racial. But, of course, the systematic everyday realities of racism in all of our institutions was no less pervasive and ongoing. Today, it's so visible, it's much less deniable, from the cell phone videos of police killing of unarmed black people to what was done to the protesters at Standing Rock, to the current administration's policies. So for white people of good intent and good faith, it's a different environment, I think. I'm encouraged to see how many white people are stepping up and wanting to figure out how they can get involved.
Mm-hmm. So as a society, what do you think for people who are of color and for those who are not, what can we do together to address this?
I think there's a lot that we can do. People of color are already doing a lot, so I'm not about to give people of color advice about what more they can do. They're out in the streets and in our institutions and all over our society, organizing and drawing attention to the issues and working for change. The real question is, what is the role of white people? A few years ago, a group of us put together a national organization called SURGE, Showing Up for Racial Justice, specifically to educate and mobilize white people so that we could show up effectively in multiracial struggles for justice. And I think there's a few things we need to think about as white people in order to be able to really show up in useful and effective ways. The first thing is to actually get better at identifying racism, at understanding how it works, what the history has been, what the current impact is, how it affects our lives as well as the lives of people of color. At SURGE, we use this concept of mutual interest, understanding that we all have an interest. We all pay some costs for racism in our society. And, of course, people of color face much more devastating costs than white people, but there's lots of costs that we pay as well, and that we have a mutual stake at fundamentally transforming our society. And that means that we need to know about how racism operates, and we need to speak up and begin to break the silence. As people in the Black Lives Matter movement have said, silence is complicity. Our passivity is really collusion with the system. So there's a whole long section in my book about how to talk to other white people, how to interrupt comments and organization policies and situations where racism is being played out, things like that.
Mm-hmm. It's really interesting. I mean, I look back on my own childhood, and my family's Portuguese-Irish, and half of my family is very dark. And I can remember not being served in a restaurant up, as along the coast in Oregon as a kid because my stepfather was too dark. And, some members of my family were too dark. And so you look at that, and it's just unreal that these things continue to happen in this day and age. You think I look at it and, gosh, I think we could be so far ahead of all this, and when we see the news or see things that are going on, it gets so disheartening sometimes because, it still is there.
Right, and I think often those of us who are white want to deny that it's still there. We keep wanting to say it's over. We're past that. And in a fairly recent poll, white respondents, a majority of white respondents actually said that racism wasn't a serious problem in our country, and a majority of the respondents said that it wasn't happening in their community. And I grew up in the West Coast thinking that racism was a problem in the South, certainly not in California. But, of course, as I grew up to really see the history of California and what was going on in our cities and counties, there was massive, pervasive amounts of racism happening, but it was much easier to think about it as happening someplace else. And I think that that's one of the first steps for those of us who are white, is to realize it's not something out there. It's in our own neighborhoods. It's in our own workplaces. It's in our school system, healthcare system, the criminal legal system. And so we have places to start. We're already inside of it. We don't have to find out where it is. We have to recognize it around us and dig in and begin to get active.
When you did your research for this 4th edition, how long did it take for you to compile the new information for it?
It actually didn't take that long because there's an amazing amount of information out there about the impact of racism in our society. There's massive amounts of studies. There's lots of books and articles and movies, and there really is, compared to when I wrote earlier editions and I had to really dig deep for the information, there's now a new generation of great resources about how racism shows up in our everyday lives and our institutions. So that wasn't so challenging. And it raises a question, well, why don't we see this? Why isn't it in our news? Why isn't it in our culture and media? Why isn't it in our textbooks? And that's one of the places, that's one of the levels that the racism is so effective at, as the cultural level of reproducing images of white people in power and control and being the heroes and saviors of other people, and people of color being portrayed as dangerous and outsiders and threats to our communities.
Yeah, it's anytime you see, it's gotten a little bit better, but when you see movies, usually people of color are typically the bad guys and the white guy is the hero. And so I think there's been a lot of dialogue about that even in Hollywood in regards to having a shift as far as that's concerned, that it's too, it's not really, in the viewpoints that people would like to see. It's one-sided.
It is, and we need to get beyond the rhetoric of, well, it's bad, but that's too bad, to think about, well, how do we make change? It's not just the movies, but the video games and the cartoons and all aspects of our culture. There are a lot of very powerful films made by and about Native Americans and African Americans and other people of color, but it took a lot of pressure in pointing out that, for instance, a year and a half ago, that the Oscars were all white, and that black filmmakers and black actors and other people of color were not getting any recognition. And then, of course, you have to look back to who's making those decisions, right? And it turns out that it's primarily networks of white people in Hollywood. So it took, publicizing, making visible, protesting, and this year there was a lot more recognition of the creative contributions of people of color in the movies. That's what it takes, not just recognizing the problem, but people coming together to actually organize and put pressure on the institutions that's where we see real change.
Yeah, that's where change will really happen. So for those of us who want to talk to our friends in regards to racism, what are some tips that we can use?
Well, as I say in my book, Uprooting Racism, there's a lot of times that we're in conversations and we hear people say things that are either subtly or very overtly racist. And often our tendency is to wait around for somebody else to speak up or to just kind of say, well, that's too bad, but it wasn't really intentional, or they probably didn't mean it. And rather than find reasons to kind of back away from that, we have to make the commitment that we are going to say something, and just to interrupt the flow, the kind of the collusion that happens when white people get together and have our conversations, where we end up putting down people of color or recent immigrants or women or people who are queer or any marginalized group. And that can be done with compassion and in a way that calls people in rather than criticizes and disrespects them. We can ask simple questions about, well, why did you say that? Or do you realize that that's disrespectful? Or I know you, and that's not the kind of person that you are, but that's what this sounds like. We can interrupt in ways that produce a conversation rather than just a condemnation and a shutting down. If it's a situation with people of color and somebody's actually being attacked or marginalized or excluded, then we need to challenge that and really think about how to interrupt that, support the person who's being marginalized, and challenge whoever is involved with that marginalization. If it's in an organization and the policies of the organization or the culture of the organization is discriminating against or marginalizing people of color, then we need to get together. We need to talk to the people of color and find out what their experience is, what they see, what they think might happen in positive ways. We need to get together with other white people and have conversations about that and talk about organizational change and how can we make some shifts in the organization.
Yeah, I think, dialogue is such an important thing in regards to this. Sometimes people just don't understand what it is that they're saying and how offensive it could be. Other times it's maybe just pure education that needs to happen.
Right, and I think that often as white people we use coded language because one thing is since the Civil Rights Movement it's become not polite to be explicitly racist, although this current administration is changing that somewhat. But we've learned as white people that when we're in public that there's certain things we shouldn't say or certain ways we shouldn't say it. So we have a coded language about inner cities and welfare and hard work and invasion of illegal aliens, all kinds of phrases we use that are very much contributing to an exclusive and culture and marginalization and vulnerability of other people. But so we have to get good at also recognizing the coded language that people use. And I have a section in my book, Uprooting Racism, that talks about some of those code words for racism. The other thing is that usually we know pretty quickly when we challenge somebody, whether they are well-intended and are just not aware of the meaning of what they're saying or the impact of what they're saying, or if it's somebody who's really digging in and is committed to really a racialized agenda and a continuation of racism. So we want to invite in and call in those who are open and who are well-meaning, and we don't want to spend a lot of time trying to convince people who, in fact, are very clear and strong in their racist agenda, and we're not going to have much impact on them.
I know in your book, Uprooting Racism, you talk about that it's good to talk about racism. Why is that?
Well, we can't do anything about it unless we talk about it, and we can't break the kind of complicity with the ongoing reproduction of it unless we learn how and practice talking, interrupting it. So at first it's not always easy. Often we're talking about family members or coworkers or neighbors, but it gets easier over time. It's something we practice and learn how to do, and there's lots of examples in my book about how to do that. But it's good because we have really serious problems around racism that impact not only people of color but white people. The state of our schools, the state of our healthcare system, the criminal legal system, all of these things are tremendously impacted and dysfunctional and lead to further violence. And if we don't talk about it, then we're colluding with it. We're allowing not just people of color, but a lot of white people to be caught up in webs of brutality, of discrimination, of lack of health care, lack of good educational opportunities, lack of social benefits. There's serious consequences if we're not talking about it.
And, gosh, when you're doing all this research and you're just on the pulse of everything that's going on in regards to this, I mean, I was so impressed not only with your book but your website, because it gives a lot of information for people who are just like, gosh, I feel like I'm kind of caught up in what's going on, and I want to make a positive impact here. I want to be able to say, hey, no, I'm not okay with with what's going on. What were some of the surprising things that you discovered along your journey?
Well, I'm not so much surprised, but continually impressed by how much people of color are doing in terms of organizing, educating, agitating, advocating for real change in our society, not just around issues of racism specifically, but in terms of around environmental racism, in terms of our healthcare system, our food system, our prison legal system. That what's surprising is we don't know more about that. Maybe that's not surprising either, given the state of our media and the misinformation we have. But it's certainly true that there is a lot going on, and and that means that there's a lot of opportunities for white people to hook in with that and get involved and really respect and listen to the leadership of people of color who are on the front lines of the struggles for racial and economic justice.
Where do you see, the future of this going? I know you've been following this for some time. Do you see kind of a light at the end of the tunnel with all of this?
I can't predict the future, and wouldn't want to. I think what's important is that the future depends upon what we do now, and we have a critical opportunity now to see beyond the present. There's, we're all upset, or many of us are upset at the current administration and the policies that are coming down and the visible kinds of racism, sexism, exploitation that's happening in our country. But the roots of that are much deeper. They're long-standing. We have centuries of patterns of an institutionalization of inequality and marginalization and violence. So we need to understand that these are long-term struggles. It's not just about changing who's president or passing one law on this issue or that we have to be working together and committed to the long-term process of social change.
So what are some of the things that you're working on currently that's kind of moving this discussion forward, other than your book that's been revised, which is fabulous, Uprooting Racism?
One of the major things that I'm working on these days is working with Showing Up for Racial Justice Surge, which is now not just a national umbrella organization, but has over 175 chapters around the country. So in many cities, suburban areas, rural areas throughout the country, there's local groups of people, white people and people of color coming together to educate and mobilize white people. And so it's a great opportunity for white people to be able to get together with others and begin to think about what's happening in my community. What are people of color doing in my community? What do they experience, and how can we get involved with that? We have a large chapter here in the Bay Area that I'm part of, and I work here locally on issues like police accountability and housing and things like that. Mm-hmm. And I'm also a regional resource person for the Northern California chapters. So I'm concerned not just with white people, with educating people, but the real key is moving into action, because that's where we're accountable, that's where we have leverage, that's where we have the ability to really shift some resources. One of the things that I have in my book, Uprooting Racism, is a couple of pages of ways to leverage our resources as white people towards racial justice and other forms of justice. And it talks about where we put our money, where we put our time, where we put our skills and experience, how we show up in public arenas, how we open up space and that we have access to, or transportation or other kinds of material resources. There's just a whole list of ways that it's important for us to think about how we can leverage whatever resources we have into the community, into the ongoing work for justice.
Mm. Well, and so if someone wants to get involved in Surge, what's a way that they can do that?
The national website is probably the easiest place to start. It is showingupforracialjustice.org. There's a list of chapters in the various states. People can also go online and Google your own town or rural area and see if there's a Surge chapter, or if there. And the thing is, Surge is a great vehicle, but it's only one vehicle. And the thing is to start the conversation, start asking questions, start bringing up racial dynamics, how you feel about what's going on in the country, talking about the Muslim ban, about the attacks on DACA youth, about the struggles at Standing Rock, about the Black Lives Matter platform. Having those conversations will produce other people around you who will identify themselves as also concerned about things and wanting to make a difference. And getting together with others is the first step to figuring out, well, okay, what is going on here and what can we do about it?
Well, I know your website's a great resource for people to connect not only with Surge, but also your book, Uprooting Racism, and then all these other different projects that you are involved in. And where exactly is that? Why don't you give the website for our listeners so they know how to connect with you and also be part of your community?
The website is just www.paul-kivel, Paulkiv as in Victor, EL.com. And like you said, there's lots of resources there. There's also resources for parents and teachers and youth workers. And there's a whole section in my book, Uprooting Racism, about working with young people, because that's another piece of the work for those of us who are white. We're raising the next generation of white leaders and adults, and we need to take seriously our responsibility, not just to the next generation, but to future generations, to be talking explicitly about race in age-appropriate ways, helping our young people prepare to live in a multicultural society, helping them prepare to be critical thinkers about the information they're getting in their textbooks and media, and helping them to prepare to step up with people of color to be active and engaged in the multiple fronts of the fight for racial justice, gender justice, economic justice, really transforming our society.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much that can be done there, and there's right now so many topics that are in the news and that are just needing more discussion on in regards to racism. So many
people are involved with issues that they care about, but not necessarily with a racial lens. So for all those of us who are working on environmental issues, we need to think about, okay, so what's the impact of racism here? Because we know that communities of color are on the front lines of both being vulnerable to climate change, like we've seen in Puerto Rico and in many other places. Mm-hmm. And they're also on the front lines of resistance to the climate change and the environmental work that's going on. So it's for many of us who are involved with some kind of project already, it's a question of adding a racial justice lens so our work becomes more effective and more inclusive.
I think most people don't even think of it that way, and that's a great, it's great information to give, because when we do look at these kind of things, we don't consider all the aspects of it.
Right. And just like we need to be thinking about gender all the time and class all the time, we need to incorporate that racial justice lens with whatever we're doing, wherever we are.
It definitely deserves the attention. My goodness. So, well, Paul, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us today and talking about your book, Uprooting Racism. We so greatly appreciate you being here.
Thank you very much for having me, and I hope people can use the book and the website and lots of other resources to get active and involved with doing racial justice work.
I hope they do too, and your website's such a great resource, and of course your book, Uprooting Racism, is something that everyone should go pick up their own copy.
And learning how we can treat each other with greater compassion, kindness, and love is a topic that is always in season. I'd like to thank everyone for taking the time on your Thanksgiving Day to tune in. You've been listening to Moments with Marianne. And remember, make every moment count.
In a single moment, your life can change. Moments with Marianne is a transformative hour that covers an endless array of topics with the best of the best. Her guests are leaders in their fields, ranging from inspirational authors, top industry leaders, and business and spiritual entrepreneurs. Each guest is gifted and a true visionary, a recognized leader in her own work, and while teaching others to develop, refocus, and grow, Marianne will bring the best guest and sometimes a special surprise. Don't miss this. You never know just which moment will change your life forever. Moments with Marianne airs every Thursday, Friday, and Sunday at 8 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Mountain Time. Make sure to tune in and visit momentswithmarianne.com for more information.